So we're going to pick up now with a look at a few of the arguments in the three dialogues between Hylas and Philonous. We saw that Philonous made fairly short work with Hylas's attempt to defend naive realism, to attempt to say that the world outside of the mind is just exactly the way that it appears to us. Hylas, however, is something to fall back on, and he goes quickly into the distinction between primary and secondary qualities, which, as we've seen, is a distinction that was introduced by Locke. So the idea here is that of the qualities that we perceive in objects, some of those qualities are resemblances, right? In other words, the way that we perceive them in the mind is actually a resemblance of what the qualities in the object are like in those objects themselves, independently of the mind, right? So those qualities that resemble are called the primary qualities. And there are other qualities which are perceived, but they're not really in the objects themselves. The primary qualities are distinguished from the secondary qualities largely by what just sort of seems right to us, it might seem to. Right? Locke does have a way to try to distinguish them, but he doesn't explicitly ground the distinction on this method, and he's also not consistent in using it. And that's the distinction between qualities that are perceived by individual senses only and qualities that are perceived by multiple senses. So there are qualities that we perceive only by a single sense. For example, color is seen but not heard or smelled, at least in the average person, okay, unless you happen to have synesthesia, okay, which was not a topic that they were concerned with or perhaps really aware of. Sound is something that you hear but you don't see. An odor is something that you can smell but you can't feel or see or hear. So many sensible qualities of things are perceived through one individual sense organ only, and not through any others. But there are also qualities that are perceived through multiple senses. Now, Locke doesn't have any example of a quality that he thinks are perceived through all of the senses, but there are qualities that are perceived through more than one sense. Motion, for example, you can perceive through sight. You can perceive it by touch as well. We could even argue maybe that you can perceive it by hearing too. Maybe, for that matter, you could even perceive motion by smell, if you might perceive a smell moving from one direction to coming from another direction. Extension or shape, figure, what Locke calls figure, is another example of a primary quality, and here too is something that we can perceive with more than one sense. You can perceive it with sight. You can also perceive it by touch as well. And in fact, an argument that was a question that was debated by the early modern philosophers was, suppose you have someone who is blind from birth, and then it's totally blind from birth, and then their sight is suddenly restored. Would that person be able to distinguish, say, a pyramid from a sphere just by looking at them, rather than without actually touching and feeling the objects? But that's something that you can perceive by more than one sense. So these qualities here, extension, figure, rest, motion, number, and solidity, these are qualities that Locke distinguishes as primary qualities. They are really existing in the objects in and of themselves. Now, if we attempt to ground this distinction on whether or not a quality can be perceived through multiple senses, then it falls down with solidity, because Locke counts solidity as one of the primary qualities as well. However, that is something that is experienced only through the sense of touch. Okay? Just by seeing something, it doesn't mean that you know that you can't walk through it and penetrate it, that it's going to be solid. In any case, Berkeley, in his attack on this, does not rely upon whether or not Locke has a good argument to distinguish them in the first place, which it seems that maybe Locke doesn't. Berkeley, however, falls back on some of the same arguments that he used against the naive realist position to tear down the distinction between primary and secondary qualities. According to the account of primary and secondary qualities, the secondary qualities that we experience, so things like colors, smells, and so forth, those are things that we experience because we are affected, right? Our sensory organs are stimulated by motions of particles, right, such as light particles, from other objects. And so, in other words, it's primary qualities from those objects that somehow affect us, and then our brain processes those stimuli and interprets them into the particular color or other experiences that we have of them. But now, what does Philonous say once Hylas introduces this distinction? Well, he uses the same relativity arguments that he used before, that perception is always relative. Right? That the way that we perceive things, and this is not limited to the so-called secondary qualities, but also our perceptions of the primary qualities, are relative to the type of sensory organs that we have and to the type of environment that we have and the way that we perceive things. Size, for example, okay, so the size of something, this is supposedly a primary quality, and Berkeley asks, or Philonous rather, asks, well, can we believe that a mite experiences and perceives size and figure in the same way that a human being does? Right? It appears quite differently to different individuals. Okay? Same thing with motion, right? Our experience of motion is relative. Indeed, it's relative one person to another person. He's quite aware that we may, in different situations, in different circumstances, experience motion quite differently. Our memories are one way where we see how motion is experienced differently. And Berkeley actually anticipates the basic principle of slow motion photography in his arguments here, because he argues that our perception of motion and of the speed of something happens is basically a sequence of ideas through time. So it depends upon the rapidity of the sequence of these ideas through time. And so Philonous argues, if the ideas proceed through your mind more rapidly, okay, then you will perceive them as perceive the occurrences happening slower than someone who perceives those as happening more slowly. It's essentially the principle of slow motion photography, right? So if you are projecting your film, say at 24 frames per second, and you film it at 60 or 80 frames per second, you're going to slow the motion down when it's projected. So this too, he says, is relative. He also argues that our perception and understanding of extension is relative. And again, here he uses the relative standpoints of different perceivers or different types of animals and what they would be able to perceive to ground this claim that it's relative. And from that, he then constructs a general argument to say that our perception of any of the so-called primary qualities is relative, because by Locke's physiological accounts, all of the primary qualities depend upon extension somehow being a primary quality, since it depends upon extension and motion, right? Our sensory organs being affected by extension and motion from the source in the objects that we perceive, and that's the root of our perception sense. So all of the primary qualities depend upon extension being a primary quality. Well, if this is relative, this is all relative to the perceiver, just as we saw that the so-called secondary qualities, as they are perceived, are relative to the perceiver, then there's really no basis whatsoever for the distinction between primary and secondary qualities. So we have no grounds for thinking that any of these qualities have any independent existence outside of their existence in a mind. And therefore, matter still is something that is unperceived. All we perceive are sensible qualities, and we don't have any evidence for supposing that those sensible qualities are anything but ideas in a mind.